Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Charlotte Webb and welcome back to this series of talks about the new MA Internet Equalities course which is launching at the Creative Computing Institute in October. Today we're going to be diving into one of the units on the course called Methods for Equitable Technology Development, and we're really lucky to have a wonderful guest to talk about that, Caroline Sinders, who I will introduce you to in a minute. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of Caroline, of the unit, and then Caroline and I will get into a discussion, and you're then welcome to ask us anything at the end. You can also feel free to drop questions into the chat below as we go along. So I'll go ahead and tell you a bit more. Caroline Sinders is a design researcher and artist. She's held residencies with the Mozilla Foundation, IBeam, BuzzFeed, Pioneer Works, as well as others. And she's currently a fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School, and her work focuses on how technology impacts society, specifically through the lens of product design, AI, social networks, and harassment. And her work's been published in Motherboard, Quartz, Gizmodo, Adobe, Wired, and others. And Caroline and I had a lot of discussions about what this unit could look like as we were in the development process, so it's great that she's here and I'm really happy, and thank you Caroline for joining us. So about the unit, it really gives the methodological foundation for the rest of the course. So it's about exploring what kind of practical approaches students can take away when they want to engage in technology development or other projects that promote equity. And I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about the words equality and equity because although they're very closely related and sometimes used interchangeably, they're distinct in important ways for this unit. So equality is about providing the same level of opportunity and support to all segments of society. But equity goes a step further, and it's really about providing various levels of opportunity and support depending on needs in order to achieve greater fairness of outcomes. So for example, in education, equality might mean providing every student with the same experience, but equity means overcoming discrimination against specific groups of people, especially as defined by race, gender, or ability. And we really want students to understand that different groups can have different outcomes because of existing advantages or disadvantages in society, and to use this knowledge to move towards creating greater equity. Ultimately, we believe that design has the potential to bring about equity and collective liberation, but only if designers consciously work to avoid reproducing inequalities. So the unit is 10 weeks long, and we'll be looking at approaches like social and participatory design, various approaches to human-computer interaction, digital ethnography, and design justice. And the unit will be delivered through lectures and seminars, critiques, visits, class-based workshops and assignments, as well as group work and peer learning. So students will be testing some of the methods they learn in class through their own independent creative practice and writing. In terms of learning outcomes, students firstly will critically analyse and evaluate methods. So this is about being able to analyse and perhaps compare methods, looking at what they have in common, where they differ, perhaps some of their limitations or problematics. Then synthesising practical, conceptual and technical knowledge of methods. Synthesis is really about bringing elements together. So this is about how you might apply some theoretical knowledge you've gained to a practical assignment, or how a method might bring about new perspectives if applied to a technology that it hasn't been applied to before. Experimenting with methods for equitable technology development, that's really about creative practice and how students are going to apply what they've been learning in a way that most resonates with the work they want to make. And finally, communicating the intentions, context, sources and arguments for experimental work. This is about honing presentation skills, developing as powerful communicators of ideas and principles. And the assessment for this unit will be an essay. There are some really interesting texts on the reading list. I'll just share a few of them. Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows and others was a 1972 report that used a computer simulation to predict the consequences of exponential economic and population growth with a finite supply of resources. So it was an exploration of how sustainable ecological and economic stability could be achieved. And it provides quite a fascinating historical backdrop to today's concerns about climate change and the impact of technologies on the environment. Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock is an exploration of how design might be led by marginalised communities, how it can dismantle structural inequality and advance collective liberation and ecological survival. And I know we're going to be discussing that a bit more with Caroline in a minute. And finally, Building Consentful Tech is a zine by Una Lee and Dan Tolliver that explores what consent means for our data, for our identities, and for our online interactions. So that's all I'm going to say about the unit itself, and I'm really happy to now get into the conversation a bit more with Caroline. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. As you know, Caroline's here, and we're going to go straight ahead and have Caroline introduce herself and tell us a bit about who she is and what she's been doing. So Caroline, it's over to you.
Great. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Charlotte, for inviting me to be here today. I really appreciate that. And as in researcher, I work at the intersections of human rights and technology. So what I do is I look at how technology impacts society through the lens of design, and then I also use art as sort of like an actuator to create work to, again, relook at and examine technology. And I look at it through a very specific kind of critical lens of pulling from human rights as well as social justice. But I'm also using a product design lens. So in a way that a technologist may look at how an algorithm is written or how like a code base is structured, I'm looking at the affordances of design. So how UX design, for example, can obfuscate black boxes inside of product design. So how Netflix is using a lot of artificial intelligence for prediction around recommendations, or how design, for example, can amplify or mitigate things like online harassment. That's been a major part of my practice for the past 8 years. We're just generally looking at how design, again, is a sort of translator. So if we start to look at dark patterns, for example, which are design patterns that can unintentionally or intentionally manipulate users, and then what are further manifestations we see in products out in the wild. So I'm looking a lot at how everyday people are, like, what they can touch in terms of design, and how that, like, touching and their understanding of design is their relationship to that product, and how that is really integral in the conversation around technology, not just how technology is built, but how technology is made, and how that making then further makes it understandable or less understandable to consumers.
Amazing. Thank you for that introduction. I wanted to ask you straight away about the field of design justice, because it's one of the things that's going to be sort of a focus point in this unit. And I'd love to hear how you understand the term design justice. What is it, and why do you think it matters?
Totally. I think my understanding of design justice is based off what I've read and how I've interacted with design justice as like a community and a network practice as well as a book. It's rethinking design processes and centering those that have been marginalized by design, and sort of expanding who makes design and how we design. So moving beyond making for, moving beyond participatory design, but moving way towards collaboration, and also then centering designers and activists and educators more in the design process who are normally left out. So when I like to unpack that last sentence, I think a lot of big Western design firms send in Western designers to places in the global South, and that designer will work with a local group and engage in participatory design, but the local group doesn't own the design process, right? Like, they're brought in as collaborators through this other firm, but they don't get a say perhaps in the entire pipeline of design, and they're, only brought in for a portion of it. And so I think of participatory design breaking down, I love that design justice is sort of pointing out that that's problematic, and then trying to push moving beyond that.
Yeah, I'm interested in one of the principles of the Design Justice Network, which is around the fact that everyone's an expert based on their own lived experience, and everyone has this unique contribution to make to the design process. But given the kind of monopoly status of big design institutions, how do you think we go about sort of convincing them to cede some control and like become less gatekeeping and open that process out more? Is what the kind of arguments that we can put to persuade big corporations that that's a good thing to do?
I feel like this is where really looking towards human rights and human rights technology is a great way to get a blueprint of what to do, because they've been doing that already in terms of working with technology, in terms of trying to push legislation or policy, for example. So I think design is like, that's one of the things that I think is exciting about this MA, is thinking, how do we start to follow those patterns and remap them for designers? So I do think a lot of that is having to sort of reteach the product design pipeline, of having to reconfigure it, of trying to open up more spaces for collaboration with NGOs. I think that there is a movement now, like there's a whole social design for good movement, right? And a lot of nonprofits, like NGO and activist starting to more designers. Design is starting to be seen in spaces where it hasn't normally been recognized as like a must-have, that, you know, need a developer to build something, developer could then be the designer. I think people are starting to realize how important design is in that process. So I think when we're starting to think, that's a backward statement. Anyway, as we're starting to look at ways to shift and change the workflow in design, especially with big tech and big design firms, I think we can start looking at how human rights and technology, like their blueprints, their pathways of how they've been sort of working around that. And I don't think there's going to be an easy solve. There's still lots of issues with big tech, you know, like for free listening to activists, but not necessarily working with them, hiring them, you know, following things to standard. But I do think that's one of the spaces we can start looking at. I don't think we need to recreate our own process from zero.
Right. And I'm really glad you brought up human rights as well, because one of the other units we're going to actually be talking about next week with Asmina is on human rights and computation. And I think the thing about this course is that there are so many cross pathways between looking at theory, looking at methods, looking at different frameworks, and there's so many commonalities and differences that are really illuminating. So that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of an avenue for persuading corporations to think about the pipeline in a different way.
Totally.
Could you give us an example of a project that you feel really embodies good design justice?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I always try to think of like product design, and or like what is a product people could play with, like kind of out in the field. I think Sasha's book covers so many great examples. Like I think Allied Media Conference, you know, where design justice came out of, is a really great example, because it's really run for and by the community, and it's figured out different ways to sort of scale up. I think like when I think of design justice, like and how it sort of impacts my everyday life, I often like look back to the human rights space. So there is a lot of really amazing listservs that have been created by researchers to try to push specific agendas forward. So I'm on one called COMO, which is about content moderation. And there's been a lot of really amazing work that's come out of that listserv, and it's really pioneered by a lot of non-cis white men, right? It's really pioneered by women, non-gender binary folks, and people of color who work on content moderation. And it's also really cross-organizational. So a lot of different people from different organizations or independent researchers like myself are invited to join. And it has this really warm community to it. The output may not be a product, right? But it's a group of researchers all working together, trying to sort of push the needle forward. And then those individual practitioners very much have a kind of design justice ethos to them, of centering marginalized voices, of working with researchers on the ground, of when the group itself is talking about publishing different things, making sure that like representatives from communities are there. And so I feel like that's where like human rights and design justice really come together pretty well, is making sure it's not just like Western white voices that are championing these really massive global causes. So that's something that like really comes to mind for me.
I think also the concept of design justice as a community as well as a set of principles and processes is really powerful. And it's making me consider how many discussions there are at the moment about what the COVID-19 situation offers in terms of some kind of return to some of the ideologies of the early internet, where it wasn't necessarily so centralized and monopolized. And I'm wondering if you think that, do you have a feeling at the moment that there's maybe some potential there for using the internet in some of the ways that it was originally intended to be used, but which have perhaps got co-opted? And how, and can design justice help to sort of funnel maybe back into some of those older ideals?
Totally. That's a really great question. I think that there's like a lot to unpack there. I do think one thing I always like to highlight is like our original internet was really, really homogenized, right? Because of how we accessed the internet would be through like educational spaces. So it was really white and really male. But I think the feeling you're hearkening to is this place of like a smaller, safer internet, and like a space of like community or communal internet. And I feel like that's really hard for us to have right now, because we live inside of these really large social networks. And in another talk I gave like a few weeks ago, the way I described it is like we're living in Mark Zuckerberg's dream, like we're living in his imaginary, but we're not living in like a Black woman feminist, not from the US. We're not living in her imaginary. So like, what would that look like? What kind of tools would we need? We're sort of living in this other space. And so, we're living in spaces where online harassment was really a many year long afterthought, right? It took many years for these companies to come around to realizing that they needed better harassment policies and better tools, and they're still not great. And I feel like with COVID-19, it's such a deeply complicated moment. Like on one hand, I think it's great that we can have these digital talks, that you and I can have this, right? Like we probably wouldn't be able to do something like this if it wasn't COVID-19. This would maybe be a physical talk, right? Like I get to attend data feminism lectures by Catherine Ignacio and Lauren Klein because they're having them online, but they normally wouldn't be online, right? They would be somewhere else. And so there is this kind of moment we're in where we're actually able to open up the conversation in a much more global way by de facto of having everything online and digitally being able to attend. But I guess what I also think about is we're also in a space, though, where a lot of the design mechanisms we would need to create a safe and equity-driven environment are still thought of too late in the game. So like Zoom is a great example of how at the beginning, in March of COVID-19, so the beginning for the Western world of engaging with COVID-19, Zoom bombing became a thing. But that, there probably were examples of that kind of harassment maybe months or years beforehand. We just didn't hear about it. So I think we're in an interesting moment to highlight how design justice principles or design principles that protect marginalized groups, of why they're so important, because I think we're seeing them at scale in a different way since everyone has to stay online. And so I think we're seeing the lack of designing with design justice out in the world, and thus seeing the harm of that maybe can create a movement towards harm reduction in terms of design. But I'm hoping that people create what I call zines and instead of encyclopedias. So instead of making, another Facebook, are they making like a tilde, or are they making like a really small chat room for their friends, or like their own BBS system? Like, I hope we see some of that start to come out. And I imagine that there are things like that we're just not hearing about. I think that would be an interesting kind of space to explore right now, but that was also a space we needed prior to COVID-19.
Right, exactly. And I think one of the things that we have to really bear in mind is that the idea that the internet now is some kind of leveler and it's going to bring about some kind of more democratic way of working and stuff, it really needs to be challenged, because obviously there's such big differences in access, differences in people's ability to actually engage in the ways that are now becoming the new normal, that we have to actually even more than ever bring a design justice lens to the situation, because otherwise we're just, as you say, in the imagination of people that aren't necessarily taking into account those inequalities. I think that the Ruha Benjamin New Jim Code kind of thesis around this idea of the imaginations, this contested territory of action, it's not something that we should take for granted, and that it does have politics, and that she says we're living sort of in the fantasies of the elite, and that's what you're talking about, and it's really important that we don't forget that, and don't take how the new normal is imagined to be a given, because it will otherwise just come from the same kind of locus as other things have come from.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's definitely, I think it's something to always like to keep that in mind of like, when we're making something, what are the harms we're replicating, even if they're harms that have been sold to us as standards, right? So like, what are the standardizations and protocols that, Silicon Valley has emphasized, that has really sort of set the course for like what design is or what engineering is in terms of a global scale? And how are those standards actually misconceptions and harms? And I think now is the perfect time to hit pause and really think about that and take a moment and really, really unpack them, especially because, we're in an environment now where everything has to be so much more digitally connected.
We were going to leave questions to the end, but one has come up, which I think is quite pertinent to what we're talking about right now. So I'm just going to read it, if that's okay. I feel like design is often a very white practice and puts itself in a supremacy position as the creative work, which is created and based often in Western cultures. How do you tackle that problem in general and attract a more diverse group of students? I think
that's...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, this is precisely what the design justice kind of position from Sasha is trying to address, is that the way that design has evolved as an industry, it has been homogenous, it has been white, and it has been very hierarchical. And that's why I think this particular approach is good, because it helps you to try to unpack that and to center other experiences more, and to have this systemic shift to where communities are much more central in the production of products and services, right? So for me, that question is exactly why we need these types of frameworks, right?
Totally. And I guess for me, the way I see it is in a slightly different lens or level. I think design has only been sold to us as a white practice. And I think the stories of success we've only seen uplifted have been like white and predominantly cis and female. I think that's not actually true. So what I'm also interested in is thinking of, and I would not be the person to teach this, is like a decolonizing design education and primer. And there are a lot of amazing designers that work on this. Louisa Prado comes to mind. This was a major part of her practice. If you look at Maurice Naliari's work of really, recentering 3D printing and digital configuring through like this lens of decolonization. From where I sit in the human rights world, there are a lot of really amazing designers and design practices across the global South that you just don't read about on adobe.com, or you just don't hear about on really big UX conference stages. That doesn't mean that they're not there. And I think a big thing is actually looking at and uplifting and like listening to those design practices and maybe centering education around that. So for me, I think the way we also think about design is really seen through like a colonial and imperialist, a very white lens. But design and art have, are a major part of every culture. It's just the way that design gets talked about has been really framed through this really US focused, very, again, Silicon Valley focused mindset. What's considered successful design is seen through that lens as well. And I think our misconception of what success is, or who the design leaders are, has been told again through this lens of, or the storytelling that's very, central to whiteness. And I think that has to be, dismantled and sort of put away. But there are a lot of, there are like major designers, major design firms, and like design existing as, a space of like cultural identity and cultural capital across all different places. Those designers just, again, don't get uplifted the way that they should.
Yeah, I think that also weaves into another section of the design justice principles, which are around the unpaid work of design and the way that it frames design as a much more everyday activity than is given credit for. And so because of that, it needs to be much more fairly compensated for. And so there's obviously a big tension there between design work being much more pervasive than we account for, and those narratives not necessarily reflecting that. But at the same time, you don't want to just say, well, it's okay because everyone's a designer, everyone designs every day, because that doesn't necessarily recognize the unfair ways in which people are compensated for the work that they do.
For sure. I think it's a lot of different complexities, right? I'm not one to adhere to pedantic definitions. Like, I'm definitely that person where I'm like, anything can be art. And that definitely pisses off a lot of my formerly artist trained friends, even though I have a background in photography. Like, I have a bachelor's of fine arts. I'm a very formally trained artist. And then I have a master's in design. It was kind of like a choose your own adventure master's from ITP. But I definitely think there are, there are design practices and design firms and design workarounds and designed objects that are not centered on like a whiteness narrative. And those practices just are not acknowledged, right? And I think it's different than the idea that everyone is a designer. Like, the idea I adhere to is that anyone could be a designer, but that like everyone is an expert. So like when you're thinking of like user groups or stakeholders, recognizing that you don't know more than the group you're studying, right, is a big thing. But also, like, when we think about then the global world we're in, like, there are designers and design firms in like every city, in every space. So when someone's like, oh, well, we couldn't find a local design firm to look for, what I hear, or to work with, is what I hear is that you just didn't work hard enough to find that local design firm. Or you had a very specific idea of what like a standard is, and it fits a non-design justice or like a non-participatory design lens, right? Like, your idea, the way, like, people put their own biases into situations without realizing it. So expecting, for example, artifacts or documentation to look a certain way is like it's like a bias. Like, artifacts can be any way. Documentation can be really anything. It doesn't have to be, a diary that you made someone keep. Like, that's a crazy artifact to ask users to make. It's really time intensive. It's really extractive. If we're going to get even more serious, like, I think IDEO, for example, is a really extractive practice to its users, and especially when it goes into like, especially when IDEO.org often goes into like foreign territories, right? Like, they're not necessarily working with like on the ground workers very well. So like, again, rethinking through like, who are you working with and how are you working with them? There are experts on the ground always. There are people that are engaging in making and design. Lots of activists who are even doing research work are also doing design work as well. They maybe just don't have an MFA in design.
We have another question which again ties in very much to what we've been discussing. Design exists all over the world. The patterns in their clothing, the colors, the forms and shapes in their structures, which oftentimes gets imitated by the highlighted white designers.
Yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree with that point. I mean, I think again, as this question slash comment sort of really poetically and perfectly highlights, like a lot of trends get appropriated by white designers, and then it's seen as a big trend, right? And it's like, I mean, I think that's just sort of a furthering of, or a perfect example of just the inequity that the tech world exists in.
Yeah, and I guess the wider media world as well, because cultural appropriation happens in so many spheres, not necessarily just tech or design, but is much broader and much more systemically problematic than that. So thank you for that comment. Caroline, I wanted to move on to one of the other texts on the reading list,
Totally.
which you recommended when we were discussing this unit, which is the Building Consentful Tech zine. And I'd love to hear from you why you feel like consent itself is an important method.
Totally. I really love this zine because I think it's really sort of straightforward and beautifully to the point. And I think also as we're thinking of building out, different reading lists and syllabi for all the different classes and movements that we're in, recognizing the power of a citation is really important, and also recognizing that self-publishing, especially when we're thinking of a design justice or an equity-driven education, is also equal. Marginalized groups are like underpublished and undercited. And then also, again, and this is my own bias coming out of the human rights and activist space, I think that there's a lot of really important research that comes out of that isn't maybe published in a book, that isn't published by a big publisher, but it's self-published, or it's published as a research paper that then turns into PDFs that are handed out, at conferences. And so I believe in the power of a PDF, of a simple document that gets right to the point. The thing I love about the zine is that thinking of consent as a way to engage with technology is really important. So how are you speaking to your users, right? What kind of choices are you presenting to them? And how are they understanding those choices? So that's why I love this virtual software movement that is, coming out of, or like that is happening right now, of just really thinking through legibility. And then what does it mean to people sort of essential choices, not just like a choice, not just something where it's like, oh, I'm going to give you an option, but actually framing it through the lens of consent.
I guess also because of the situation that we're in now, consent kind of emerges in a even more important light, right? When we're thinking about data and how data about us might be used for all manner of things related to tracking and tracing, which of course has its own politics. So to me, when I was looking at this and thinking about consent as a method and as a really, really important kind of cornerstone of design, it just made me think so much about the situation we're in now and all the risks that a lack of consent could pose.
Totally. Well, and I also think too, and this is something that I'm sure we'll get into in the masters, is like, well, then what is consent and data tracking? So like, is current manifestation of GDPR UI's consent? Not really. Like, do people know everything that they're agreeing to? Are those are those options presented in like legible interfaces? Are they written in plain language? And so what I love about consent is it's not just yes, I agree, or no, I don't. If you think about real consent, it's understanding like the weight of the choice you're making and having, all the choices articulated. So you kind of can't obfuscate or hide part of an answer, right? You have to, like, true consent is really like, this is how I'm going to use your data in all of these different ways. And I have to make sure that like you understand it and that I'm not tricking you or hiding something. So you're only agreeing to part of the answer, right? Like a partial consent, because that's not a full consent. And so that's also what I love about this idea is it's not really a simple thing. Like it may sound easy, tell people what they're agreeing to. But then when you start to think of it in practice and think of how often do you really engage in like true consensual interactions with software and technology, right? Even when you're like clicking a yes box and you have the option to click no, is it truly, truly a consensual choice? And that's what I find, again, really, really powerful about that movement.
It's making me think about Payal Aurora and her work around the next billion users and the ways that issues like, for example, privacy don't show up in the same way in different areas of the world. So in a country in Europe, for example, like we're concerned about government surveillance because our government functions in a certain way. But if you live in a country which doesn't have the same kind of governmental stability that's run by the mafia or militia or something like that, then actually the types of privacy concerns you have are much more likely to be around family, for example, because you're not visible to the government in the same way because you don't have a kind of recognized status in the same way. So I think that's another thing that we'll be doing is not necessarily, well, trying to look at these types of issues from that kind of global perspective and understand that what they mean in one place is not what they mean in another.
Totally. And I think this is where human rights is very key in that. Like, this is where I've been really grateful for my background in human rights is being able to have real use cases of really actually, not making it a tangential, not a tangential, but like a faraway thought of like, in some other space, this is going to be different. It's like knowing actually the facts of like what that space is, of being able to hear from, an activist or policymaker in that area of like, of what's happening. And I think this is, again, like one of the reasons why human rights is so necessary to be really injected into design, is because like these are not edge cases, right? If design is a global medium, which it is, if any kind of app we make can be used by anyone, then if you're designing for only the people you can sort of see around you, you're designing a very biased, non-equity driven app. I like to say it's a bug is a feature until you fix it. So if you're thinking of certain use cases as like, well, that's, I'm worried about this one kind of surveillance, but not another kind because only, like 5 users have that effect. It's like, well, great, but you're still endangering that percentage of users. You're still endangering like actual people. Like another analogy or not analogy, another thing I like to say is, I think I've said this before in a feminist internet talk, is like every data point about online harassment is a real person's traumatic story. So even if you create an app where only 2% of users are facing harassment, like that's real harassment that real people are facing. And so as we're like thinking through like designing, we have to think through all of the harms of how our designs could go wrong and that we are responsible as creators and as designers for those harms. Those harms are not accidents. Those harms are not like edge cases. Those harms are real harms.
Completely agree. I wanted to ask you, Caroline, what would you love to see students on this unit explore?
I think a variety of things. Like, I think this is something we've talked about is maybe thinking of ways to help the students link up with actual NGOs. So if I were teaching the course, one thing I would love to do is try to actually have students really plug into NGOs and think tanks and small nonprofits that are working on the front lines of this. So they actually get a sense of what it looks like to design, to work with, work with different human rights groups. or if there's a way to like try to replicate that process somehow in the classroom. I think one thing that people forget is when you work in like civic technology or in human rights, you move slow and you have to be nice to people. So if Silicon Valley is move fast and break things, move really slow in the nonprofit NGO world. You can't build something in 6 weeks, right? Like you have to really think about one MVP. Like what is like the small thing I'm making? Really, what do people need? Not what do I, the designer, think they need, not I, as a designer, am I deciding someone needs? You really remove ego from the design process. And that's where earlier, I mentioned the power of the PDF. Like sometimes if you think like, oh, I'm working with this group and they need like some kind of better security protocol, that may not actually be an app, that may be, a piece of paper that gets printed out and is turned into like face-to-face digital or face-to-face trainings, on like security for your devices, right? It may not actually be like a technical fix. And so I'm hoping that the MFA or the MA like really explores that of what does it mean as a designer to actually research something and make something, but what you've made is not maybe an artifact. What is it then? And I think that's an important lesson I've learned in this space as a design researcher.
I mean, one of the things I appreciated most in our conversations was that you really emphasize always this issue about timescale and how you can't rush genuine community engagement. And that's a real challenge for designing a curriculum for a course, which is 1 year long in total. But when a unit runs over 10 weeks, it's a real challenge to think about how you could do that meaningfully. So I think in this case, it is, as you say, about looking at what's an MVP, how can we engage with organizations that are doing it in a longer term sense so that you can really understand and observe that process. And hopefully when you go on to do projects beyond the course, you can bring all of those methods to your more lifelong practice.
For sure. I mean, I think that's also something that like will be in the course as well, is like imagining if we had a really long time, like what would the process look like, and then trying to teach that process. But that's also where I'm hoping we can really work with different NGOs, even in a small way, just so people get a sense of what it feels like in the day-to-day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we'll get a flavour of that from the guest lectures as well, because the course is going to be quite diverse in terms of the teaching staff, both in terms of backgrounds and disciplines, but also it has to be that way because it requires so much specialist knowledge and so many kind of context specific insights that we want to reach out to as many organizations as we can to make sure that students get a sense of how it works in practice. Okay, so just a final question from me. What kind of questions would you encourage students to ask themselves when they're getting to grips with the different methods on this unit?
Oh, that's such a good question. This is the question I always ask myself, perhaps later on, which is what could possibly go wrong? And then like outlining that always at every step of the way, and going from like the extreme, like the most extreme example, all the way down to like the very, very small, benign example. And do you have a solution for that? And if you don't, why? Like, so I want people to really think through as they prioritize what they're making, and often this actually comes down to the users they're prioritizing, whether they like that, or how are you prioritizing things? Who are you thinking about? And can we shift that a bit? Can we rework those priorities? Can we work through this idea of what it is and what they need? And really also that designers learn how to let go of ego. Like I see this being a master's in learning to work out an ego, of really, really working with different groups. And I think that this is helpful across design practice and art practice, of when you're making something driven by human rights and then truly by social justice. If you're making something that you're hoping will be used by a group or impacted with a group, removing your own ego from the process of what you think they need.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and it made me think back to what you said right at the beginning about art being an actuator, and how when we have this kind of practice as central to social justice or design justice, or trying to develop projects that have a social impact, that those questions around authorship and what the role of the artist has traditionally been and how it can be challenged are very, very important, and sometimes a bit overlooked because we don't necessarily always bring together the creative disciplines with the more activist work.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, and it's something I think about a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot of different practices I find really influential. Design justice is one of them. Another one is arte utile by Tanya Bruguera. And really just unpacking, I think it's important in any discipline for the designer or the artist or the creator to sort of pause and say, well, what is something that I'm insisting on? And like, what viewpoint am I insisting on, right? Like, why does this feature really need to be here? Why this framing? Is it something that I'm asking for? Or is it something that whatever we're making really needs? Am I centering my needs before others? And I think it should be needs before needs of yourself or of your product. And that's what I mean of like really trying to remove ego out of the process.
I think that's such a fascinating challenge, really, because art practice in a kind of pure sense by itself hasn't necessarily always had to ask itself those questions, or hasn't challenged artists to ask themselves those questions. So again, when you have this kind of interdisciplinary or like hybrid practice, the nature of those questions, the nature of what you need to be accountable for or responsible for as an artist become inflected in a really interesting new way.
Totally. I mean, it's definitely also something where people, art can be active and then it has to be entirely social justice project, even though I think most things should be. But social justice art doesn't necessarily mean it's human rights based art, right? And so figuring out that movement of art, like activist designed art versus, and then I think this is where like looking at art versus arte utile is really important. Like utilitarianism in terms of design and art means then I think like letting go of your ego as the creator. But okay, you want to make something that's designed to be like an activist space, right? That is designed to sort of say something or respond to the moment. But that's where I also say, but then that's not necessarily like human rights based work, right? So you can make something that's a provocation and reflect provocation you as the creator want in the world, and that's fine. But then that makes it not necessarily human rights based work. And so that's where I want people to put it. If someone's like, this project's going to solve these answers, that can't be like, you can't be one deciding that's successful in that. But if you want to make something that's like a provocation to highlight an issue, then I think that's like a different kind of work. That is, I would say, like, I'm not the right way. It's almost like, throwing up a flag in a way.
Yeah.
Of like highlighting something for the moment and recognizing that that's maybe a very momentary project, that exists for that moment, you're putting it down. The human rights work I think of as like sustainability. It's, knowing that, like if you're making something that it needs to be sustainable for communities, that it needs to be, made with communities in mind. And I think Sasha's book really gets into this of work that, people make with the best intentions, but that have like kind of the worst outcomes because it's not sustainable for the communities to use, right? It's like a fancy solution that doesn't have like a lot of longevity in mind. And I think, again, that's where like letting go of the ego and trying to figure out like, what are you making is really important.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's really the journey that people will be on this course, because it's about figuring out what is your creative practice, where on this sort of spectrum of activism and maybe art or design practice do you want to sit? What do you feel like is the function of the art and design element of it for what you want to create in terms of social impact, etc. So those are the things that I think from a creative practice perspective are just really fascinating, kind of knotty questions for each individual student to be asking themselves.
Totally. And I also think one thing that could be interesting is, you can take a project and maybe map it through all of those different processes and see how it changes, right? Maybe it's the idea, maybe if there's a theme or a thought you explore, how do you get the idea from it being an art project to activist-based art to social justice, human rights, right? And output of what you're making will probably be really different for all of those, all of those points. Like the output for the human rights part may be you helped make one small thing as a part of a really big collaborative project with an NGO, right? The social justice part may be something else. The activist part may be some really beautiful, like speculative fiction. That doesn't mean there isn't a usefulness in the activist part, but I think it's recognizing that one thing may not fit all of the buckets. And so you have to make and shift and adjust depending upon the intention you have for the project.
Totally. Amazing. Thank you, Caroline. We've got a few minutes for questions. If anyone wants to type questions into the chat, feel free. We do have one around the reading list. For the moment, we can't publish the whole thing, but if you email the CCI, so that is, hang on a second, cci@arts.ac.uk, we can, we should be able to send it to you individually. I think we don't have any more questions directly to answer right now, but people can type questions below and we can come back to them after this session. So I think if we don't have anything else for now, I'm just going to say a huge thank you to you, Caroline. It's been really lovely talking to you. Really appreciate your input. And I think it's been a conversation that's given a really good sense of some of the things that we might be looking at on the course, some of the kind of practices that we'll be engaging with. And yeah, it's just been a lot of fun. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.